Talking about how good a racket is in terms of power, spin, and control is all good and well, but at the end of the day, the final exam for how good a frame is how well it does in terms of sales. So let's get into another top 5. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. So it's been a little over a year since I covered the best-selling rackets of 2023, and I was really excited to revisit that concept for 2024 because that was one of the first videos that really put this channel on the map. That makes sense, people want to know what sells, and the reality is, usually rackets that sell well are also pretty darn good. After analyzing our metrics since the beginning of January, I can tell you that is definitely the case again this year. All of the rackets on this list would easily make my personal favorite top 10 list. So I'm going to cover the top 5 best sellers of the year, talk about what makes them so good, and also talk about why they might be more popular than rackets that are also very good but don't sell quite as well. Now, of course, before we get into any of that, let me remind you that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. Bear with me for a second, I do just quickly want to go over some of the themes that stuck out to me with all these rackets, especially comparing them to last year's list. Some of the rackets that were in the top 5 last year aren't anywhere near this list, and some of the rackets that didn't make it last year are pretty far up. It's obvious that new rackets generate a buzz and that translates to sales. Maybe that's why some of the brands have so many racket lines, so they have a new racket coming out all the time. The other thing is that, kind of like last year, the best-selling rackets do really well in terms of all-around playability. That makes sense. Being good at most things means you complement most people's styles, so more people will buy your racket. The last thing is that 1820s are nowhere near this list. I get it, they're harder to generate power and spin with, and their denser string bed makes for a smaller sweet spot, but I do wish more people would give 1820s a shot. They offer really good playability that's harder to market than 1619s, but with the right string setup, they can be just as spin-friendly, powerful, and user-friendly, so I think I might make a video soon about just how good 1820s actually are. Let me know if that's something that would interest you, but enough yapping, this video is going to be long enough, so let's get right into number 5. Alright, so coming in at number 5, we have the Babolat Pure Aero 98. Now this one is easy. The reason it sells so well is because of how much I've been praising it over the past year. So Babolat, I'm expecting my paycheck very soon. It definitely has nothing to do with the fact that Alcaraz and Rune are endorsing it, pretty much every other young rising pro is using it, and definitely nothing to do with its playability. Just kidding, the Aero 98 is a fantastic frame, but I was a little surprised to see it so high up because it's definitely not the most user-friendly racket of all time. It has quite a small sweet spot, and it's the kind of racket that requires a very fast, full, and clean stroke to get the most out of. The thing is, for advanced players who know how to swing it, it offers some of the most unique playability I've ever felt because it basically perfectly complements every aspect of modern tennis. Obviously, having the Aero name, it's phenomenal for spin, but it's in terms of power and precision that it really sets itself apart from frames like the Aero 100 and even rackets like the VCore 98 and Extreme Tour. Because the sweet spot is quite small, there's this very crisp pop off the string bed when you hit it right. It's really quite an addictive racket. It's kind of cool because usually that addictive feel only comes from thin-beamed control rackets, so the Aero 98 is kind of paving its own path, which is why I think so many advanced modern players like it so much. Also, because it's a spin-oriented 98, it's very aerodynamic, so it's super maneuverable, which makes it great at the net and also the type of racket you really want to hit touch shots with. Really, Alcaraz is the perfect example of what playing this racket to its fullest potential can give you. A weapon all around the court that really comes into its own when you accelerate your stroke. It's not necessarily the most well-rounded racket because it is quite difficult to use, but advanced players won't care about that, and it has that feel X factor that those types of players almost require. It's also a relatively new racket design from Babolat, so the fact that it's already made it into the top 5 is pretty astonishing, and I only see it growing in popularity as more people play with it and realize its high potential. Let's move on to number 4, the Babolat Pure Drive 100. Now, it's important to note that there is a pretty big gap between the Pure Aero 98 and the Pure Drive, and we should also remember that last year this was actually number 1. Has the Pure Drive gotten worse? Has the competition gotten better? No to both of those. No dedicated power racket has come out since last year that can rival the Pure Drive in terms of playability. The reason it's lower just comes back to what I was saying earlier. People like new stuff. This racket came out in 2021. It's been nearly 3 3 years and it's still in the top 5, and I'm sure that as soon as they update it, it will go right back up to 1 or 2 as long as they don't butcher it. Now, what makes the Pure Drive so special is that it is technically a power racket, but it isn't exclusive to players who want to play a power-oriented game. The power you can generate doesn't come at the expense of consistency, and that isn't always the case with rackets that have a thick beam, stiff flex, and 16x19 string pattern. That consistency makes it feel more solid, reliable, and predictable, and that opens it up for more advanced players who require that, but don't always find it with this style of racket. That's really the key here. It's certainly not a control racket, but it doesn't lack control, and when you combine that with all its other qualities, it's a logical choice for so many. Of course, its other qualities are power, spin, and user friendliness. That last one is crucial and another major reason for why it sells so well. Pretty much any player can grab it and instantly hit well with it. The other thing with the Pure Drive is that every time they change it, they're incremental changes that improve it but don't totally overhaul its playability, and they've been doing that for years, 30 years to be exact. Recently, Babolat has mainly looked to improve its comfort. It's no secret that this was quite an uncomfortable racket for a long time, but that's just not the case anymore. The dampening is very effective, and while its high stiffness means that it'll never be a real pillow, most players can use it without any problems nowadays. So yeah, Pure Drive 4th, I'm definitely not surprised that it's still in the top 5 despite its age. If anything, I'm surprised it's not higher, and I think we'll probably be looking at this in the number 1 spot next year. Coming in at number 3, we have the Babolat Pure Aero 100. And by the way, we're waiting on a new shipment right now, so I'm showing you the 98 again. And if you notice that right away, you have a very keen eye. Honestly, you can kind of copy paste what I just said about the Pure Drive and apply it here, except replace everything I said about power with spin. This is a spin racket that complements a spin style extremely well, without sacrificing too much control and consistency to get there. Probably even more than power rackets, spin rackets have a tendency to be a little wild for players who don't hit with tons of spin. That's definitely been the case historically, but even with some current spin rackets. It was actually a major issue with Pure Aeros, in particular between 2016 and 2022. Babolat took a huge leap of faith with this one by toning the spin back in exchange for that much better control. It's a gamble that paid off, and unsurprisingly, we're seeing the rest of the industry's spin rackets follow suit. Massive spin potential was fun to play around with, and I'm glad that we tested its limits, but this is a much better racket than any of those wild spin monsters of yesteryear. One other thing that has really impressed me with the current Aero is its feel. Again, feel wasn't really a major point of emphasis with older Aeros, or really any stiff Babolat 100. This has the best feel of any Aero I've used, and I hope the next Pure Drive goes the same direction with whatever technology they're using in here. Now obviously there's another Aero on this list, and I'm just now realizing that every racket we've talked about so far are Babolats, which is kind of crazy. But the reason this comes in higher than the 98 is of course that user friendliness. Like I said, that's extremely important to be a bestseller. I don't think this is technically a better racket than the 98, but because players can instantly mesh with it easier, it sells better. I am guessing we'll see a similar drop in sales next year like we did with the Pure Drive this year, and then once they release the next one, it'll go right back up to the top of the list. That's the Babolat way. Coming in at number 2, we have our first Wilson racket, the Blade 98 V9 16x19. The Blade was third last year, it's now swapped with the 100, and that's in large part because it's been updated to the V9, so naturally it generated that new racket buzz. Apart from that though, it's a fantastic racket, and in particular the V9 I think is the best Blade we've had in years because the major update they made this time around is in feel. The last couple of Blades had a slightly mushy, disconnected feel for the ball, and they did a great job sharpening it up as they claimed in their marketing for this racket. Now a small spoiler for what's coming next, the Blade is the only true control racket on this list. In fact, it's the only racket with a beam thinner than 22 millimeters. While many players love control rackets, their main issue is that they're not easy to use. 1, because they have small sweet spots, and 2, because they require more weight to be as playable as 100s. Wilson has successfully addressed both those issues with the Blade line, using layup technologies to expand the sweet spot and make it more stable at lower swing weights. The result is a racket that maintains that control DNA, but it's also so much easier to use than rackets like the Percept, Pure Strike, and Gravity Pro that it opens itself up to a much wider player base. So when you're the number 1 racket of choice for advanced players, also user-friendly enough for lower level players, that's a recipe for success and why the Blade sells so well. It's also a racket that's ripe for customization. I always add a leather grip, which helps to stabilize it further and also gives me a bit more feedback. You can also add lead to the hoop if you want to bring the swing weight up closer to what is more common with other control rackets, so yeah, plenty of choice. But anyways, let's move on to number 1. Coming in at number 1, we have the Head Speed MP. Now, I was shocked by this, not because it's a bad racket, but because of the way it looks. Like, seriously, this is what you guys want to buy? The good news is, if you're like me and let's just say aren't the biggest fan of this paint job, you can go for the absolutely gorgeous Speed Legend MP, which is the exact same racket, just painted black. To be honest, I was still a little surprised that the Speed MP was #1 because last year it wasn't even in the top 5, and now it's pretty clearly in first place. Its playability is great, and we'll get into that in a second, but there are a lot of other rackets that have really good playability that get nowhere near this list. So first let's talk about some of the things that might make the Speed so popular. Novak Djokovic. For some reason, I've always put him a notch under Federer and Rafa in terms of marketability, nothing else. I don't want to get into a GOAT conversation here, but that might not be the case. The thing is, there's another guy endorsing the Speed MP now, Jannik Sinner. I'm not saying he's as powerful for marketing as Djokovic is, but watching Sinner, it's pretty hard not to want to play like him. He's got some of the cleanest ground strokes we've ever seen and generates ridiculous power with seemingly so little effort. His game is very aesthetically pleasing, so I wouldn't be surprised if that's also helping the Speed line quite a bit. Head also exploited a gap in the market with the Speed. The Pure Drive dominates power, the Aero dominates spin, the Blade dominates control, but there was no racket for well-rounded playability, and that's what this racket does so well. And finally, the Speed has been around for more than a decade now. It took a while to get here, but its popularity is down to Head maintaining consistency version after version, similar to what Babolat has done with the Pure Drive. This new one is an improvement on the previous one, but not a massive overhaul, so players who used it can easily make the change, and it's been that way for a while now. Now let's talk more about that playability, because I have recently developed this newfound love for the Speed. It's such a great racket because it is so good at so many things. What I said about the Pure Drive, Aero, and Blade being good at power, spin, and control, but still good in other departments is true, but they are still power, spin, and control rackets. The Speed is a power, spin, and control racket. Not one of those characteristics stands out more than the other, so as well-rounded as all the other rackets are on this list, they just aren't quite as much as the Speed. To be honest, every time I play with it, I tell myself, Luca, you should make the effort to switch because it would be really good for your game. Because it complements so many different types of strokes, it allows me to vary my shot selection depending on what situation I find myself in on the court. It's a really impressive racket, and as a bit of a Head fanboy myself, I'm glad that it's finally getting its flowers and doing really well for the brand. We're also starting to see other brands trying to make their own version of the Speed MP, similar to when everyone was making power and spin rackets to match the Pure Drive and Aero. The Blade 100, Strike 100, Percept 100, they're all similar in that they're 100s that excel in most playability characteristics, but I have to say the Speed MP still has them beat for now. So if this list has proven anything to us, it's that if you want to sell the best, you need to be the best. Every racket on this list is the cream of the crop in its category. The Pure Drive is the best power racket, the Aero is the best spin racket, the Speed is the best all-around racket, and the Blade is the best control racket. I might personally disagree with that one, but it is tough to argue objectively. Now when I say the best, I don't mean go for one of these and nothing else. Other rackets may still be better for certain individuals, including myself, but these are the ones that seem to hit the nail on the head best for the average consumer. Once again, I had a really fun time making this list. I wanted to do it now because it's been over a year since the last one, but this is something we should probably revisit at the end of the year. We'll see about that, but for now, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of these rackets, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.